Welcome back, boxing fans. In the world of Hajime no Ippo, series author George Morikawa has created hundreds of characters and boxers, but of course, some are stronger than the rest. In today's analysis, I want to take a look at a really unique and consistent theme that Morikawa has worked into a number of the strongest characters on the world stage. We first start to get a glimpse at Morikawa's perfect boxer when we see our first major world level match, Date vs Ricardo Martinez. Heading into the match, the last time we saw Date fight seriously was against Ippo, where Morikawa introduced the concept of heavy fists into the story. Date is shown to be one of the characters with the heaviest of fists too, as his backstory reveals that he ties almost all of his self-worth into boxing. Date enters into the fight as the character with the best technical skill and the strongest mentality that we've seen in the story so far. Unfortunately for Date, his opponent is a god of boxing, Ricardo Martinez. Date's first move in the fight is excellent, albeit a little bit of a double-edged sword, throwing two rough lefts off the bat to blow away Ricardo's guard and smack him in the face. Ricardo responds to this calmly, trying to step back and take his rhythm, but Date doesn't allow him to do so, driving in and piling on aggressive rough punches. When his coach reminisces is actually his old style, in contrast to the more technical fighter that we saw against Ippo. This is actually the first hint that we get about Morikawa's perfect boxer, as it's now driven home that Date is already trying to fuse a more animalistic and violent approach with high-level technical skills. Ricardo, though, doesn't panic, and he calmly executes a maneuver to switch places with Date, throwing a left that Date avoids with a neck turn, showing his technical abilities once again. As the round continues, both fighters test one another with their lefts, showing restraint and engaging in a high-level battle. The first round ends with the fighters both relatively uninjured. The problems for Date start here, though. In his corner, Ricardo predicts to his second Bill that the gap between the two is still enormous, saying that he'll end the fight in round 2. Ricardo starts round 2 with a huge right, quieting the audience. This is an immediate change from his earlier style, which was more reserved and elegant. Ricardo goes on to push Date all the way to the ropes using feints, and ultimately pins him in the corner, predicting all of Date's tricks to escape. Ricardo lands heavy punch after heavy punch, including a counter to Date's stomach, looking almost like a different fighter compared to round 1. As round 2 ends, Ricardo returns to his corner and he opines to Bill that it wouldn't be so bad if he returned to who he was, mentioning that he developed his technical style as part of his obligation to defend the belt consistently. Ricardo mentions that he's grown tired of living like this, and when he enters round 3, his transformation has fully completed. Date is totally unable to fight back as Ricardo unleashes non-stop rapid-fire combinations into him, all of them aimed at vitals. Takamura even goes on to describe Ricardo as merciless, mentioning that he doesn't seem like the same boxer anymore, but that this is his true face. Bill goes on to identify Date's error, reminding Ricardo of his original style, and from here on out we see one of the most savage beatdowns in the series. Bill goes on to mention science and violence, which is the main idea here. Morikawa is saying that the best boxers in the world are able to balance the two into sort of a unique, fused style, and we see it first really here with Date and Ricardo. Ultimately, late in the fight, Ricardo has beaten Date to within an inch of his life, breaking his wrist and his jaw. Ricardo goes on to lament that Date might become an unfortunate accident. This really emphasizes the bloodlust within the Mexican champion. Date draws praise from Ricardo in his internal monologue, but the damage is far too severe. Ricardo fighting in this perfectly fused state has put Date one foot in the grave and given us our first example of the perfect boxer. The next time that this theme comes up in a really big way is in the series' best arc, the Battle of the Hawks. During the build-up to this fight, we get to see some of Hawk's previous victories, including 2 ringouts. The Kamigawa Gym boys take special note of how unorthodox Hawk's fighting style is, with Fuji claiming that it's a modern form of street fighting where he uses his animalistic instinct. The group of them go on to conclude that he's just like Takamura, but they're actually making one big mistake that will be revealed during the fight itself. As the match begins, we see Hawk take up an incredibly unique fighting stance, which once again signals his disdain for the science of boxing. Takamura draws a contrast to this, even though he's normally just as wild, and he pulls up an orthodox guard. With a perfect left, Takamura starts the fight, throwing the punch that Kamigawa engraved into him over years of hard work. The fight seems to be going Takamura's way until Hawk reveals another absurd attack not in any textbook, leaning on the ropes and throwing an unusual uppercut. Kamigawa and his crew are surprised at this, exclaiming that there's really no way to even classify the punch. The fight unfolds into Hawk's pace as Takamura seems unable to cope with him. Japan's Hawk starts to get frustrated, monologuing to himself that the champion should at least act the part a little bit more, again kind of drawing that contrast between what Takamura and co see as the ideal boxer and what Hawk is doing. This contrast is strengthened in the coming pages as Takamura refuses to run from the corner even after receiving a massive right. With his decision to fight it out, Takamura throws a compact left, breaking Hawk's guard before slamming another left into his body. Having lowered Hawk's hands with the body blow, he sends one up top, then below again, following textbook combination patterns. Hawk's second, Miguel Zale, notices Takamura's highly polished style and remarks that he is fighting with logic, going on to compliment him afterwards. This is Morikawa stating the major theme very plainly in the text, as Miguel then goes on to claim that Hawk's wildness can't be beaten using traditional boxing methods. Concluding that Hawk's style is simply violent, Miguel seems to think that modern boxing is entirely incapable of handling this world champion. Interestingly, we later see Miguel team up with Wally, who shows that he has a habit of finding these unique, talented, kind of offbeat fighters, although some of them are of course nicer than others. The peanut gallery starts to panic, with Miyata in particular incensed at how Hawk is fighting and its efficiency. This is another neat bit of character writing from Morikawa, as Miyata is clearly the most textbook fighter out of the crew that he's with, including Sendo and Date. The second round then starts with Takamura adamant about proving that Kamigawa's boxing works on the world stage, which shows his deep respect for the sport, juxtaposed with Hawk's violent indifference. Takamura begins to pressure Hawk with tiny, compact lefts, which serve as a microcosm of what Morikawa considers technical boxing. He then unleashes a violent combination of small jabs and footwork, finally pinning Hawk relatively decisively for the first time in the match. Ultimately, just like I learned in my first month of boxing class, Takamura uses his left to gauge the distance for a right straight, throwing a beautiful 1-2 that shows his dedication to the basics. Takamura's ascendancy doesn't last long, though, and the two engage in a close-up fight, which ends with Hawk landing a massive right swing. Takamura miraculously manages to recover, and when he regains consciousness, we see him rely on Kamigawa's boxing one more time, landing a series of perfectly placed lefts combined with the step-in that he was taught. Kamigawa rejoices like a proud father, seeing the techniques he drilled into his student work to neutralize one of the world champion's most important techniques, his incredible and offbeat sway back. Takamura goes on to deliver a piece of praise to Kamigawa that he'll remember for the rest of his life, telling him that his boxing works against the world's best. Up to this point in the fight, Morikawa has been showing us that Takamura has perfected the logical side of fighting, but we all know him better than that, and we know he won't stay that way the entire fight. Takamura confirms to himself that he's shown the logical side of the coach's boxing enough, and he's now going to move into his usual, more animalistic and violent style, declaring that it's payback time. A famous massive punch indicates the shift in the match, as the two Hawks start to duel using their favorite styles. Takamura, on his part, lowers his guard to Ippo's astonishment, while Kamigawa essentially starts praying, wanting to see the beauty of Takamura's natural style against the strongest opponents on the world stage. Miguel seems to think that this strategy is more challenging than if they had just stuck with logic, but he also thinks that Hawk is still going to win. A brutal hitting match follows as Kamigawa asks to see it prove to him that Takamura's power can defeat the greatest in the world. The two go back and forth, with Takamura seeming to gain a bit of a lead, as Kamigawa remarks that he's now using his original style, which was honed after countless street fights. Remarking that the shackles have now been removed, Kamigawa marvels at Takamura's evolved fighting sense, which was sealed under his respect and admiration for the art of boxing. Ultimately, Takamura's gamble with his weight control catches up to him, and he's essentially out of energy. Unable to practice either the logical or the violent side of boxing, he enters the ring to a massive deadly right from Hawk. Side note, I think this is the punch that started his eye problems, but I'll do a video on that in a different day. The fight continues and Takamura gets savagely beat, eventually being knocked unconscious where he hallucinates Hawk. We then get one of the most legendary moments in all of shonen manga, as Takamura pulls his last bit of wild energy out of himself, screaming that it's all Hawk's fault. Takamura rushes to unleash a string of deadly attacks as he enters a fully animalistic state. In what has to be the most savage combination in the entire manga, Takamura dismantles Hawk with a series of body blows which combine his violent rage with his logical training, as all of the punches are directed exactly at Hawk's vital points. At this point in the fight, Takamura is growing rapidly before our eyes. Aoki and the crew remark that what he's doing is remarkable, as Kimura remarks that his training is remembered even if he's unconscious. Again, this is Morikawa hammering home the theme. The perfect boxer is someone who fuses the natural, animalistic, and violent side with precise, trained, and technical boxing. An enormous uppercut gives Takamura a critical down, and he finally wakes up in the aftermath. We get the ultimate reiteration of this theme in the closing chapters. Miguel, out of options, has to ask Hawk to rely on his wild instincts when pushed into a corner. Takamura delivers a beautiful combination which seems close to sealing the deal, but an undercurrent of fear overtakes the camp as Miguel decides to bet that Hawk might have a wild awakening within him just like Takamura. And he does. He's right. Unleashing his sway late in the game to dodge a lethal left from Takamura, Hawk's eyes glow a dark blood red as he aims a critical counter at Takamura, one which would end the match if it connects. Takamura, though, narrowly dodges the hit, landing a legendary counter into Hawk, essentially ending the fight. As the reality of Takamura's victory sets in for Miguel, he remarks that Takamura represents the merging of instincts and intelligence, which is boxing's ideal. At this point, Morikawa's underlying idea is pretty clear. The perfect boxer is someone who has a special, instinctual fighting method which combines with a firm foundation of technical ability through training. It is not a coincidence that both of the super champions we see in the series, Takamura and Ricardo, somewhat embody this ideal. Without making this video too long, there are two more fighters that I want to mention briefly before talking a little bit about Ippo. The first of these is Volg Zangief, who reintroduced this idea in a big way in the latter part of the manga. Volg's fight against Mike Elliott goes some way towards reinforcing the perfect boxer theme. The bulk of the fight is a technical affair, where both fighters engage analytically and aim to counter the other. The two duel with high-level lefts, as Sendo and Ippo notice that Volg is fighting aggressively while still maintaining calm. As the fight grows, Elliott seems to revel in the fact that it's like a chess game, which is actually his first sign of weakness. Just like Brian Hawk was tilted too far to the wild side, Mike Elliott is tilted too far to the intelligent side. In the end, Volg takes his first major step toward winning by executing a complicated multi-step plan involving a splitting left uppercut thrown as a sacrifice to hide his white fang. We get one of the absolute best three-panel sequences in the entire story here, as Mike shows arrogance to Volg before being obliterated by an off-screen punch. You'd be forgiven for thinking that Volg had done enough to win the title at this point, but in true Morikawa fashion, he decides to push the character to his utmost limit. Thankfully, though, this allows us to engage with the intelligence and violence theme again, as Mike Elliott is picked up off the ground by a corrupt referee. Volg thinks to himself about his decisions and the determination that his path has required, finally deciding to let his true instincts take over, shedding his human facade and moving like a wolf. Mike, as a purely logical boxer, feels overwhelmed by Volg's immense animalistic presence. With little strategy, Volg begins moving solely on instinct, throwing weight fang combinations over and over and over. As Volg remembers all of the work that it took for him to get there, he lands a final combination which puts Elliott down for good. While Mike Elliott was a strong world champion, once again, Morikawa's perfect boxer appears as a fusion of the two worlds, which is almost always enough to beat someone who specializes in just one. The last boxer I want to mention before talking a little bit about Ippo is Alfredo Gonzalez, specifically in his fight against Sendo. As we saw in the fight against Ippo, Alf has an extremely high level of technical skill, similar to Ricardo Martinez. However, he's also known as Metzli, a name which invokes his desire to brawl in violent, savage matches. We see that the technical style keeps Sendo at bay for a lot of the early rounds, but ultimately the Tiger manages to force Alf to change his style through constant and unrelenting pressure. Alf's coach claims that Sendo made a big mistake, forcing Alf to show his original style as we see Alf explode in a fit of violence. Alf's coach again remarks about the dichotomy, saying that Alf's fists are hot but his head is cool, before claiming that Alf is the perfect fusion of insanity and composure. We see Alf's mastered style in full display throughout the fight as he delivers unrelenting, complicated combinations into Sendo, who responds with fewer but far more dangerous punches. The fight is vicious, and Sendo seems to defy this writing pattern ultimately for Morikawa, relying entirely on his wild style of boxing. In the end, Sendo wins with an enormous smash. So I do kind of wonder what Morikawa was trying to say here, but I think it has something to do with the falling through the cracks metaphor that was introduced back in chapter 793, where Fuji shows us that extreme-shaped rocks don't fall through the cracks. Also, very large rocks like Takamura or Ricardo also don't fall through the cracks. I think here Sendo is an extreme rock, while Alf was just a big rock. Finally, I wanted to talk briefly about what Ippo might look like as he works towards an ideal like this. I really don't know quite how it will go, as we've only really seen Ippo angry or violent, I think 2 times in the series. I think the cleanest picture, though, that we've gotten for what this fusion will look like for Ippo came during his spar with Volg in Mexico, where he became weirdly fixated on paying Volg back for the help that he provided in his fight against Takamura. This focused, almost pathological Ippo has shown a ludicrous increase in strength compared to what he was like before he retired, now being able to fight evenly with a heavier world champion for some time. Ippo gets genuinely weird during the fight, with a focus as intense as some of his biggest actual fights. Ippo gets so focused that he does something I would never have thought possible for him. He catches the White Fang from Volg before pushing him back with a right straight. Volg, on his part, gets genuinely serious in the spar, frustrated at how Ippo is keeping up with him, and he starts to break out complicated tactics, although Ippo seems to handle them significantly better than when he was active. In one of the coolest moments of the retirement saga, Ippo unleashes the new Dempsey roll with his eyes spiraling like a madman. His internal monologue continues chanting to pay Volg back in this hilarious but violent way, and ultimately Sendo ends the fight in one of the funniest panels in a long time. One reasonable criticism might be that this is not an ideal that Ippo can reach, given his gentle nature. Sendo seems to think so, claiming that someone like Wally lacks bloodlust, which he thinks is necessary to beat Ricardo. Ippo, however, strongly disagrees, and he contends that bloodlust isn't something that would be the deciding factor, and he thinks that Wally is good enough as he is. This makes me think that the wildness part, the sort of instinctual part in Morikawa's eyes, might not necessarily be the same as violent, but they're kind of in a similar category. There is some freedom, though, that comes with being incredibly good at boxing that allows you to ascend even further. I think that's kind of the core idea here. In any case, over the coming arcs, we're going to get an even more clear picture about this theme. It's a big part of what Morikawa thinks is important to the story and the world stage, so I really look forward to seeing how it evolves. Alright, peace.